My husband threw a glass at my face and changed my whole life for the better. Now he's back to ruin it. My husband permanently scarred my face. It was exactly what I needed. My husband Jackson came home from work early and drunk, and the first thing he did once inside the door was hurl a pint glass at me. No greeting, no hug or kiss, just glass shattering against my cheekbone and blood running down my face. I ran to the kitchen and pressed a dish towel to my face, all while he screamed that no one would ever want me now that I was damaged goods. The ER doctor said the cut would leave a permanent scar running from my left temple to the corner of my mouth and asked if I wanted to file a police report. I'd covered for Jackson for years, but knowing that my face was ruined was the last straw. I'd always wanted to be a model, even though Jackson has forbidden it. Now that dream was dead, and I was done. I said yes. I wanted to file a report, while Jackson's mother called me 46 times to say I was overreacting and ruining her son's future over a little accident. 6 weeks later, I was living in a women's shelter with a restraining order and a face that made strangers stare, then quickly look away. The scar had healed into a curved line that looked like a crescent moon had been carved into my skin. I wore hoodies with the hood up even in summer, and avoided mirrors because Jackson's voice saying "damaged goods" played on repeat in my head. But slowly, I started going to the support group meetings where other women had their own scars, both visible and hidden. The counselor kept telling us we were survivors, not victims, but I still flinched whenever someone looked at my face too long. Then a photographer approached me at a coffee shop saying my face was the most interesting thing she'd photographed in years. She said the scar made me look like a warrior goddess, and asked if I'd model for her portfolio about resilience and beauty. I thought she was mocking me until she showed me the test shots on her camera, where somehow the scar caught the light and made me look powerful instead of broken. Within a month, those photos went viral on Instagram with millions of women sharing them and calling me brave and beautiful. A modeling agency called saying they wanted to sign me specifically because my scar told a story that resonated with people tired of perfect faces. My first campaign was for a major makeup brand with the tagline, "Beauty isn't perfect," and my scarred face was on billboards in Times Square. Every interview asked about the scar, and I told the truth about Jackson, and suddenly I was getting invited to speak at conferences about domestic violence. The modeling money let me start a foundation for women escaping abuse. I was on magazine covers, and women would stop me crying, saying my story gave them courage to leave their own abusers. Jackson lost everything once my story went public, and his company fired him for reputational damage. His mother called begging me to stop ruining his life, but I wasn't doing anything except telling the truth when asked. Sophie, my assistant, forwarded me screenshots showing he was living in his car after being evicted and getting rejected from every job once they Googled his name. His new girlfriend had left him when she found out what he did, and his friends disappeared once the news articles started circulating. He'd gone from a successful marketing executive to unemployable pariah in less than a year, while I was getting paid 6 figures to be the face of survivor campaigns. I was preparing for my TED Talk about reclaiming your narrative after trauma when my lawyer called saying Jackson was suing me for defamation and intentional infliction of emotional distress. He claimed I'd deliberately destroyed his life by lying about the incident and was seeking $10 million in damages plus a gag order preventing me from ever mentioning him again. He says he has proof that you injured yourself to frame him, my lawyer said, reading from the filing. He's also claiming the scar was self-inflicted for attention and that you've built your entire career on destroying an innocent man. I felt my hands start shaking as she continued reading his allegations that I'd planned everything to become famous. The worst part is he's representing himself, but he's got a team of men's rights activists funding his case, and they're already spinning this online as a false accusation that ruined a good man's life. She paused before delivering the final blow that made my blood turn to ice. He's demanding a jury trial and says he has witnesses who will testify that you were unstable and violent throughout your marriage. I stared at my scar in the mirror, knowing every word he said was a lie, but also knowing that Jackson had always been able to make people believe whatever version of reality he created. Requested Reds is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. My phone was still in my hand when I ended the call with my lawyer and scrolled through my contacts to find Melinda Perkins. My fingers kept missing the right letters because they were shaking so bad. Melinda had helped me get the restraining order months ago, and she already knew everything about Jackson and what he'd done to me. The phone rang 4 times before she picked up, and I could barely get the words out about the lawsuit. She told me to breathe and that she'd been expecting something like this because abusers always try to regain control through the courts. I paced around my apartment while she explained that we had strong defenses and that Jackson was making a huge mistake by coming after me legally. That afternoon, a courier knocked on my door with a thick manila envelope that required my signature. I signed with a shaky hand and took the package inside, where I sat on my couch staring at it for 10 minutes before opening it. The stack of papers inside was almost 2 inches thick, with Jackson's lawsuit claiming I'd carved my own face for attention and fame. There were photos of my scar from different angles with red arrows pointing to spots and handwritten notes about inconsistent wound patterns. One photo had circles drawn around the edges of my scar with notes saying the angle was wrong for thrown glass. Another page had screenshots from my Instagram with yellow highlights over captions where I'd mentioned my modeling career. I ran to the bathroom and threw up everything in my stomach while the papers scattered across the bathroom floor. Melinda called me back and we spent 3 hours on the phone going through every single claim Jackson was making. She read each allegation out loud while I told her exactly what really happened that night and in our marriage. Jackson was claiming I'd been planning this for months and had hurt myself to frame him for assault. He said I'd researched facial injuries online and picked the perfect spot to cut myself for maximum sympathy. Melinda explained that lawsuits like this are meant to silence victims and drain their resources through legal fees. She said we had anti-slap laws on our side which protect people from frivolous lawsuits meant to stop free speech. The next morning, my brand manager called while I was making coffee, and her voice had that careful, professional tone that meant bad news. She said the company was monitoring the situation and wouldn't pull my campaign yet, but I heard what she wasn't saying. My contracts were now hanging by a thread, and any bad publicity could end everything I'd built. Sophie texted me right after with links to online forums where men's rights activists were calling me a liar and false accuser. They'd posted fake evidence photos showing how someone could cut themselves to look like thrown glass injuries. One post had over 10,000 shares claiming I'd destroyed an innocent man's life for money and fame. The comments were full of people saying I should be in jail for what I'd done to Jackson. Someone had even created a whole website dedicated to proving my scar was fake with diagrams and medical terminology I didn't understand. I met Melinda in person at her downtown office that afternoon, where she had law books spread across her conference table. She explained that anti-SLAPP stood for Strategic Lawsuit Against Public Participation, and these laws existed specifically for cases like mine. She showed me similar cases where abusers had sued their victims for speaking out and lost badly. We spent 2 hours drafting a motion to dismiss most of Jackson's claims as legally baseless attempts to silence me. She said his emotional distress claim was weak, because telling the truth about abuse isn't grounds for a lawsuit. That evening, FundMe called from the women's shelter where I'd stayed after leaving Jackson to check how I was handling everything. She said Jackson filing this lawsuit was a form of continued abuse, and we needed to update my safety plan immediately. We went through scenarios of what Jackson might do next and how I could protect myself if he escalated. She reminded me to vary my routes to work and to let someone know where I was at all times. FundMe also suggested I document everything, including saving all the online harassment in case we needed it for court. That night, I sat on my bed with my phone scrolling through hundreds of old photos from the past 5 years. There were pictures of me before the scar when my face was unmarked and I smiled in every photo. Then photos during my marriage where my smile got smaller and smaller until it disappeared completely. The photos after I left showed my scar healing from an angry red line to the pale curve it was now. I found one photo from our wedding where Jackson's hand was gripping my arm, so tight you could see my skin bunching up. Another photo from a company party showed a bruise on my shoulder that I'd covered with makeup but was still visible. These photos reminded me what I'd survived and what I was fighting to protect by telling my truth. Melinda called the next day to warn me that discovery meant Jackson could request access to my texts, emails, and medical records. The thought of his lawyers going through years of my private messages looking for anything to twist made my skin crawl. They could request my therapy notes where I'd talked about my darkest moments after leaving him. They could dig through my medical history trying to find proof I'd ever hurt myself before. Melinda said we'd fight every unreasonable request, but some information would have to be shared as part of the legal process. Elise called that afternoon about the gallery show next month that would feature the photos she'd taken of me. She was worried the controversy might affect attendance, or that protesters might show up to disrupt the event. We talked about whether to postpone, but I refused to let Jackson control my career timeline or make me hide. The photos were about survival and strength, and backing down now would let him win all over again. 3 days later, my phone buzzed with a notification from an email address I didn't recognize, and when I opened it, my stomach dropped. The message had 4 photos attached, showing what looked like me holding a razor blade to my arm and face with blood visible in each image. The photos were good, really good, and if I didn't know better, I might have believed they were real myself. The sender wrote that unless I publicly admitted I'd lied about Jackson and dropped all accusations, they'd release these to every media outlet that had covered my story. My hands shook as I forwarded everything to Melinda, who called within 10 minutes telling me not to respond to anything online or in interviews while she prepared our anti-SLAPP motion. She said this was classic intimidation, and we'd handle it through proper legal channels, but the silence while lies spread across social media felt worse than being physically hurt. I spent the rest of that day watching my mentions fill with people questioning if maybe Jackson was telling the truth after all. That night, I pulled out the folder with my restraining order paperwork and went through every page making sure I hadn't accidentally violated any terms that Jackson's team could use against me. The order said I couldn't contact him directly or through third parties, and I had to stay 500 feet away from him at all times. I checked my calendar for the past 6 months, confirming I'd never been anywhere near his usual spots, and saved screenshots proving my location on days he might claim I'd violated the order. The next morning, the TED Talk organizers called asking about additional security measures given the controversy and whether the lawsuit might overshadow my message about survivor empowerment. I told them I was sued but wouldn't let that silence me, and they agreed to add extra security personnel for the event just in case. Later that afternoon, FundMe came to my apartment with a notebook, and we spent 3 hours creating a detailed safety plan for my upcoming travel schedule. We mapped out backup routes from every venue to safe locations and created a list of emergency contacts in each city I'd be visiting. She taught me grounding exercises where I'd name 5 things I could see, 4 I could touch, 3 I could hear, 2 I could smell, and 1 I could taste to stay present if I started panicking during depositions. We practiced scenarios where Jackson's lawyer would try to make me angry or upset, and how I could breathe through it without reacting. That night, around 2 in the morning, I couldn't sleep and started spiraling about whether people would believe Jackson's version of events over mine. I called Elise even though it was late, and she answered on the second ring like she'd been waiting for my call. She reminded me that my scar tells its own truth, and no amount of lies could change the medical evidence of how it happened. She suggested we document this whole legal journey through photos too, showing the reality of fighting back against an abuser in court. The next week, Melinda filed our anti-slap motion, arguing that my speaking about domestic violence was protected speech on a matter of public concern. The motion was 40 pages long with case citations showing how courts had consistently protected survivors' right to tell their stories. Melinda was confident we'd win this part, but warned that Jackson's team would fight hard and probably file their own motions trying to complicate things. 2 days after our filing, Jackson posted a 20-page affidavit on a men's rights website with screenshots of text messages from our marriage taken completely out of context. One message where I'd joked about being clumsy after dropping my phone was presented as proof I injured myself regularly. Another text where I'd said I was tired of fighting was twisted to mean I was mentally unstable and violent. The comments under his post called me every name imaginable, and some people started a hashtag claiming I was the real abuser. My phone rang that afternoon, and the caller introduced himself as Desmond Price, an investigative journalist who'd been following cases of litigation abuse against domestic violence survivors. He wanted background information for a piece he was writing about how the legal system gets weaponized against victims. I was wary of talking to any journalist, but agreed to an off-the-record conversation about the patterns I was seeing in Jackson's tactics. We talked for an hour about how abusers use lawsuits to maintain control and drain their victims financially and emotionally. The next morning, Sophie forwarded me an email from the makeup brand's legal department saying they were pausing my campaign pending the lawsuit's outcome. The email used corporate language about protecting brand reputation, but what it meant was I'd lost my biggest source of income. I opened my banking app and calculated how long my savings would last, while paying Melinda's fees and my regular expenses. If this dragged on more than 6 months, I'd be in serious trouble financially. Sophie helped me update my budget, cutting everything non-essential, and started reaching out to other brands to see if anyone would still work with me despite the controversy. Most didn't even respond, and the ones that did said they'd have to wait until the legal situation was resolved. I looked at my scar in the bathroom mirror that night, thinking about how it had gone from my shame to my power, and now felt like a target Jackson was using to destroy me all over again. FundMe called me the next morning and said we needed to work on keeping me steady during questioning since Jackson's team would try to make me lose control. She came to my apartment with a stack of papers and started drilling me with the worst questions she could think of. "Did you ever hit Jackson back?" she asked while I sat on my couch trying not to shake. "Tell me about your drinking habits during the marriage." She kept pushing harder with each question while teaching me to count my breaths between answers. We practiced for 3 hours with her playing Jackson's lawyer and getting more aggressive each round. She showed me how to press my feet flat on the floor to stay grounded when someone was yelling at me. Every time I started to panic, she'd stop and make me practice the breathing pattern until my heart rate slowed down. By the end, I could answer even her nastiest questions without my voice shaking too much. 2 days later, Melinda called with good news that the court had scheduled our anti-slap hearing for next month. The judge also put a temporary hold on some of Jackson's discovery requests, which meant he couldn't demand every email and text from my entire life yet. She explained this gave us breathing room to build our case without him fishing through everything looking for dirt. The hearing date was circled on my calendar in red pen, and I stared at it every morning. That afternoon, Jackson's lawyer called Melinda about a possible settlement that would make everything go away. The terms included me paying Jackson $50,000 and signing a complete gag order about our marriage and the injury. They also wanted a statement saying the whole thing was a misunderstanding, and that Jackson never meant to hurt me. Melinda read me the offer over the phone while I paced around my kitchen feeling sick. I told her absolutely not to any deal that included a gag order since my whole career was built on telling my truth. But I said we could offer narrow terms where I wouldn't mention him specifically in paid campaigns or use his full name in ads. My general advocacy work and speaking about domestic violence would continue no matter what they demanded. Melinda drafted a counteroffer that protected my right to speak, while giving Jackson some privacy from commercial campaigns. The next morning, Sophie forwarded me a link to a men's rights podcast that made my blood run cold. They'd gotten hold of a voicemail I'd left Jackson 6 months ago and edited it to make me sound crazy. In the full message, I was calling about him showing up at my gym, which violated the restraining order. But they'd cut out all the context and just played the part where I was yelling at him to leave me alone. The comments under the podcast called me unhinged and violent, and said I was the real abuser all along. People were sharing it everywhere and creating memes about crazy ex-wives who ruin innocent men. My mentions were flooded with hate messages and threats from strangers who'd never heard my side. Elise texted asking if I was okay, and suggested we meet to talk about a new photo project. Over coffee, she proposed documenting my legal journey with honest photos instead of glamorous ones. She wanted to capture me reviewing documents late at night and preparing for court, and all the unglamorous reality behind the survivor story. The photos would show the actual work of fighting back instead of just the polished end result. I agreed because people needed to see that justice wasn't pretty or easy, but grinding and exhausting. We started that week with Elise photographing me surrounded by legal papers with bags under my eyes. Meanwhile, Desmond had been digging into the medical evidence and called with an update. He'd verified with hospital administrators that my injury pattern was consistent with glass thrown from across a room. The angle and depth of the cuts matched exactly what I'd said happened that night. He was building a timeline using medical records and police reports that completely contradicted Jackson's version of events. The hospital even had security footage showing Jackson's car in the parking lot that night. But 3 days later, everything fell apart when someone posted my shelter address online. Sophie saw it first on a forum where people were planning to show up and confront me about my lies. I had to pack everything I owned into boxes within 2 hours and move to a safe location immediately. The shelter staff helped me load my car while checking over their shoulders for anyone watching. That feeling of running and hiding brought back all the fear from when I first left Jackson. I spent that night in a motel under a fake name, jumping at every sound outside the door. Melinda worked overtime filing a motion to exclude irrelevant information from any trial. She wanted to block Jackson from bringing up my dating history or any medical issues that had nothing to do with the case. We were building legal walls around what he could use against me in court. The motion was dense with case law showing that past relationships and unrelated health information weren't relevant to whether he threw glass at my face. Every page we filed felt like armor protecting me from his attempts to dig through my whole life. My therapist scheduled extra sessions to prepare me for cross-examination, and we practiced verbal grounding techniques. She taught me to pause and take a breath before answering any question, no matter how aggressive the lawyer got. We role-played different scenarios where she'd interrupt me or twist my words to see if I could stay calm. She kept reminding me that staying composed wasn't the same as giving in or being weak. The techniques were about keeping my power when someone was trying to take it away through intimidation. 3 days later, my old neighbor called out of nowhere saying she'd seen the news about Jackson's lawsuit and wanted to help. She lived 2 doors down from us for 3 years and heard him screaming through the walls more times than she could count. She remembered calling the cops twice when it got really bad and saw the bruises on my arms when I'd pick up packages in the hallway. Her voice shook as she told me she always wondered if she should have done more back then. I gave her Melinda's number and she agreed to testify about everything she witnessed during those years. The relief of having someone else confirm what happened made me cry in my car for 20 minutes. But that same afternoon, Sophie forwarded an email from another makeup brand canceling our upcoming campaign, worth $40,000. They cited concerns about ongoing legal matters affecting their brand image and wished me well in resolving my personal issues. I opened my financial spreadsheet and calculated how long my savings would last, with mounting legal fees and lost income. 3 months if I was careful. Maybe 4 if I cut everything to basics. The reality of what fighting back was costing hit me harder than any of Jackson's lies. Desmond called the next morning with information he'd been digging up about the men's rights group funding Jackson's case. He'd traced their donations through public records and found most of the money came from anonymous shell companies registered in Delaware. The same companies had funded harassment campaigns against other women who spoke publicly about abuse. He asked if I wanted him to expose the network in his article, but I worried about making myself an even bigger target. These groups had already posted my shelter address online, and I couldn't handle more escalation right now. I told him to hold off while I talked to Melinda about the risks. 2 days later, Jackson's lawyer filed a motion demanding every single one of my mental health records from the past 10 years. The filing claimed my psychological instability was directly relevant to whether I could accurately recall events or might have injured myself. Reading through the pages of invasive demands felt like Jackson was trying to crawl inside my head again. They wanted therapy notes, medication lists, hospital admissions, everything that would let them paint me as crazy. Melinda immediately started drafting a protective order to limit what they could access. She explained that trauma recovery wasn't the same as instability, and my seeking help after abuse shouldn't be used against me. We spent hours going through what was actually relevant versus what was just meant to intimidate and embarrass me. The motion argued that only treatment dates and diagnoses were potentially relevant, not detailed session notes or personal revelations. Every legal filing felt like building a wall between Jackson and my most vulnerable moments. Meanwhile, Elise had been working on the photos from our documentation sessions and asked me to come see the test prints. The images showed me surrounded by legal papers with exhaustion written across my face. Another showed me practicing deposition answers in the mirror with my hands clenched into fists. They weren't glamorous or inspiring like the campaign photos, but they showed something real about what survival actually looked like. For the first time, I saw my story as powerful instead of just painful. She wanted to release them as a series about the unglamorous reality of seeking justice. The courthouse clerk called to notify us that Judge Sinead Maloney had been assigned to our case. Melinda's whole mood lifted when she heard the name because Judge Maloney was known for running an efficient courtroom and shutting down grandstanding. She didn't tolerate lawyers who tried to turn proceedings into performances and stuck closely to legal standards. Melinda said this was good news since we had medical evidence and witness testimony on our side. Facts mattered more than theatrics in Judge Maloney's courtroom. A week later, we got the ruling on Jackson's motion for my medical records. The judge denied most of his requests, but allowed him to get basic treatment dates and general diagnoses from the past 5 years. It felt like a partial victory that still left me exposed. Knowing Jackson would see that I'd been in therapy and on anxiety medication made my skin crawl. But at least he wouldn't get the actual session notes where I'd talked about him. The court also set the deposition schedule with me going first, then our neighbor witness, then the ER doctor who treated my injury. Looking at the calendar and seeing the date circled made my anxiety spike so bad I couldn't eat for 2 days. Melinda scheduled extra prep sessions where we practiced every possible question Jackson's lawyer might ask. She taught me to pause before answering, to ask for clarification if needed, and to never volunteer information beyond what was asked. We went over my story again and again until I could tell it without getting emotional. The morning of my deposition arrived and I threw up twice before leaving my apartment. Jackson's lawyer was a thin man with cold eyes who interrupted me constantly and twisted everything I said. He'd ask a question then cut me off mid-answer to ask something else. When I described the night Jackson threw the glass, he kept asking if I was sure about tiny details like what color shirt Jackson wore. Melinda objected when he got too aggressive, using legal terms I didn't understand to protect me within the rules. I focused on my breathing exercises and kept my answers short and factual. When he implied I'd been drinking that night, I calmly said no and didn't elaborate even though I wanted to scream. 6 hours of questions designed to make me doubt myself and look like a liar. But I held steady using every grounding technique my therapist had taught me. My hands stayed flat on the table instead of shaking, and my voice stayed level even when he raised his voice. The deposition finally ended after what felt like days, but was really just 6 hours of him trying to break me down. 2 days later, our neighbor from the old building showed up for her deposition looking nervous but determined. She brought copies of the police reports from when she'd called about the screaming coming through our shared wall. Her hands shook as she described seeing the bruises on my arms when I'd get the mail, and how I'd always make excuses about being clumsy. Jackson's lawyer tried to suggest she was misremembering or exaggerating, but she had dates written in her diary that matched the police calls. She even had photos she'd taken of my bruises through her peephole because she was worried about me, but didn't know how to help. The lawyer kept pressing her about whether she actually saw Jackson hit me, but she stayed calm and repeated that she saw the results and heard the fights. When she left the conference room, she squeezed my hand and whispered that she was sorry she hadn't done more back then. The next week, the ER doctor who treated my face that night came in for his deposition carrying a thick folder of medical records. He laid out x-rays and photos of my injury while explaining the angle of the cut and how the glass fragments were embedded. Jackson's lawyer tried to argue that I could have thrown the glass at myself, but the doctor pulled out diagrams showing the trajectory was impossible for self-infliction. He explained how defensive wounds look different from attack wounds, and mine showed clear signs of being struck from several feet away. The doctor stayed professional even when the lawyer got frustrated and started raising his voice about medical opinions versus facts. He simply pointed to each piece of evidence and repeated his medical findings based on 20 years of emergency room experience. Jackson's deposition happened 3 days later, and Melinda warned me it might get ugly since he was representing himself now. He showed up in a wrinkled suit looking like he hadn't slept in days with papers spilling out of a briefcase. Melinda started with simple questions about the night he threw the glass, but his story kept changing with each answer. First, he said he wasn't home, then admitted he was there but claimed I threw it at myself, then changed it to an accident. Every time Melinda pressed for details, he'd get angry and start yelling about how this was all a conspiracy to ruin him. She'd calmly ask him to answer the question while marking each contradiction in her notes for the trial. At one point, he slammed his hand on the table and screamed that I was a lying witch who'd planned everything. The court reporter had to ask him 3 times to speak more clearly because his rants were becoming incoherent. By the end, he'd contradicted his own affidavit 12 times and admitted he'd been drinking that night after denying it earlier. 2 weeks later, we went to court for the anti-slap hearing where Melinda would argue that my speaking about abuse was protected free speech. The courtroom was packed with reporters and some of the men's rights activists who'd been funding Jackson's case. Judge Maloney entered looking stern and immediately told everyone she'd remove anyone who disrupted the proceedings. Melinda stood up and explained how my story about surviving abuse was a matter of public concern protected by the First Amendment. She showed how Jackson's lawsuit was designed to silence me from speaking about domestic violence at all. Jackson's lawyer argued that I'd become a public figure making money off destroying Jackson, so I'd opened myself to defamation claims. Judge Maloney asked pointed questions about what specific statements I'd made that were provably false. The lawyer fumbled through his notes trying to find examples, but kept coming back to vague claims about ruining Jackson's reputation. After 2 hours of arguments, Judge Maloney called a recess to review the evidence and came back with her ruling. She granted our motion partially by dismissing all the defamation claims since Jackson couldn't prove any false statements. But she let a narrow emotional distress claim continue to trial, saying Jackson might have grounds there. Melinda squeezed my shoulder, saying this was actually a big win since most of his case was now gone. The judge then awarded me partial attorney fees for the dismissed claims, which would help with the mounting legal bills. It wasn't enough to cover everything, but getting $30,000 back made a huge difference to my bank account. Sophie had been monitoring online reactions during the hearing and showed me her phone afterward with mixed responses. Some people who'd been attacking me posted apologies saying they'd been wrong to doubt my story. But others doubled down on their conspiracy theories, claiming the judge was biased or that I'd paid off witnesses. The truth coming out in court didn't magically change everyone's mind about what happened. That evening, the TED Talk organizers called about my upcoming speech scheduled for next month. They suggested pre-recording it in a controlled studio environment instead of doing it live for safety reasons. After what happened in court with the activists showing up, I agreed that having control over the recording made more sense. We scheduled the studio session for the following week so I'd have time to practice without worrying about disruptions. A month later, Judge Maloney scheduled a settlement conference to try resolving the case before trial. She had us in separate rooms while she went back and forth trying to find middle ground between our positions. Melinda came back from one session saying Jackson's position was softening as the trial date got closer, and reality set in. He'd offered to drop everything if I signed a complete non-disclosure agreement about our entire relationship. But when Melinda countered that I'd agree not to name him in paid campaigns but needed to continue my advocacy work, he exploded. Judge Maloney came to our room looking frustrated, saying Jackson absolutely refused any deal that let me speak about domestic violence even generally. His insistence on controlling whether I could even say the words domestic violence showed he hadn't changed at all from the man who used to control what I wore and who I talked to. 2 weeks after the failed settlement conference, Elise texted me photos she'd been taking during our legal meetings and court appearances. The images showed me hunched over documents with dark circles under my eyes, walking into the courthouse with my shoulders tight, sitting in waiting rooms staring at nothing. She'd captured the exhaustion and fear that magazines never wanted to show. She asked if she could post them online as a series about what fighting back really looks like. I said yes because I was tired of pretending this was easy or empowering when most days it felt like drowning. She uploaded them to her photography account that night with simple captions about the reality of seeking justice. Within hours, thousands of people were sharing them and commenting that they finally saw themselves in these images instead of the polished survivor narrative. Women messaged saying the photos made them feel less alone in their own legal battles. The response wasn't viral or sensational, but it was real and thoughtful. People connected with seeing the mess and exhaustion instead of another inspirational story. 3 days before trial, Melinda filed motions about what evidence could be presented. She argued that random social media posts from strangers couldn't be used to prove I'd caused Jackson emotional distress. Judge Maloney agreed and ruled that only my direct statements about Jackson could be considered, not what other people said online. She also narrowed Jackson's emotional distress claim to only provable damages from my specific actions, not general reputation harm. The judge excluded most of the conspiracy theory posts and fake evidence that Jackson wanted to present. Our case was getting stronger while his was falling apart piece by piece. Melinda explained that without the social media pylon as evidence, Jackson would have to prove I personally and intentionally caused him harm. The morning of trial, I threw up twice before leaving for court. My hands shook as I put on the suit Melinda had picked out. Professional, but not too expensive looking. When we arrived at the courthouse, Jackson was already there with stacks of folders and no lawyer. His attorney had withdrawn the week before, citing irreconcilable differences. Jackson stood at the defendant's table alone, shuffling through papers and muttering to himself. The jury filed in, looking curious about why someone was representing himself. Jackson's opening statement was 20 minutes of rambling about conspiracy and persecution. He jumped between topics without finishing thoughts and kept raising his voice when talking about the injustice done to him. Several jurors shifted uncomfortably in their seats as he got more agitated. He showed blown-up photos of my scar, claiming the angles proved self-harm, but couldn't explain his theory clearly. His hands shook as he fumbled with exhibits and dropped papers on the floor. By the time he finished, the jury looked confused and uncomfortable with his energy. Melinda's opening was calm and focused on facts and timeline. When my turn came to testify, I walked to the witness stand, feeling everyone's eyes on my scar. Melinda had prepared me to stick to simple facts without exaggeration or absolute statements. I described the night Jackson threw the glass using specific details, but avoiding words like always or never that could be challenged. I talked about going to the hospital and filing the police report without adding emotional commentary. When Melinda asked about my modeling career, I explained how it started with Elise approaching me, not seeking fame. I kept my answers short and factual even when I wanted to explain more. The jury watched me closely, and several nodded when I described the medical treatment. I focused on breathing slowly and keeping my voice steady instead of getting emotional. Jackson's cross-examination started immediately after lunch. He stood too close to the witness stand and spoke too loudly from the first question. He asked if I'd ever been clumsy, and I said sometimes, like everyone. He tried to twist that into admission that I could have hurt myself, but I calmly repeated that he threw the glass. He showed old text messages where I'd joked about tripping, but I explained jokes weren't proof of self-harm. Every time he raised his voice, I paused, took a breath, and answered quietly, which made his yelling seem worse. He asked the same questions different ways, trying to trip me up, but I stuck to consistent answers. When he got frustrated and slammed his hand on the table, Judge Maloney warned him about courtroom behavior. He accused me of planning everything for money, and I simply said no without elaborating or defending. The grounding techniques Funmi had taught me kept me centered even when he stood there screaming questions. After 3 hours, Judge Maloney ended the cross-examination saying we'd continue tomorrow. That night, I couldn't eat and barely slept, but Melinda said I'd done perfectly by staying calm. The next day, our witnesses testified, starting with the neighbor from our old building. She described hearing Jackson yelling and seeing bruises on my arms multiple times during our marriage. She'd called police twice when the screaming got too loud and had the reports to prove it. Jackson tried to cross-examine her, but she wouldn't be rattled and stuck to what she'd personally witnessed. The ER doctor testified about the glass injury pattern and angle, showing it came from across the room. He explained how self-inflicted wounds look different, and my injury didn't match those patterns at all. His medical expertise and calm professional manner made his testimony impossible to dismiss. A co-worker I'd forgotten about came forward saying she'd seen me crying at work with visible injuries. She'd documented dates in her calendar because she'd been worried about me. Jackson objected constantly during her testimony, but Judge Maloney overruled him each time. When the doctor contradicted Jackson's self-harm theory, Jackson completely lost control in court. He started yelling that the doctor was lying and part of the conspiracy against him. Judge Maloney told him to sit down, but he kept shouting about corruption and bias. She threatened contempt charges and had the bailiff step forward before Jackson finally stopped. The jury stared at him with shock and discomfort as he muttered angrily at his table. Several jurors looked at me with something like sympathy after seeing his explosion. His true personality was showing through, and they could see exactly who he really was. During closing arguments, Melinda stood calmly and talked about truth versus suppression. She reminded the jury that survivors have the right to tell their stories without being sued into silence. She pointed out that I'd never named Jackson in paid campaigns, and only spoke truthfully when asked directly. She showed how his lawsuit was designed to control my voice, just like he'd controlled me during marriage. Jackson's closing was more rambling about persecution and how I'd ruined his perfect life. He couldn't explain why multiple witnesses corroborated my version, or why medical evidence supported me. The jury deliberated for 4 hours while I sat in the hallway trying not to panic. When they came back, they'd found for me on all counts and ruled Jackson liable for litigation abuse. They awarded no damages to him and specifically stated they found my testimony credible and his not. The verdict felt like the world finally saying out loud that I'd been telling the truth all along. Relief hit me so hard I started crying right there in the courtroom. 2 weeks later, we were back for the attorney fee hearing from the anti-SLAPP ruling. Judge Maloney reviewed the billing records and awarded me $40,000 in fees, though my actual costs were over $60,000. It wasn't full recovery, but it helped with the financial damage from defending against his lawsuit. Jackson had to write the check within 30 days or face wage garnishment. Walking out of court that final time, I felt lighter even though I was still $20,000 in debt from the case. 3 weeks later, Melinda called me back to her office to work out the final details with Jackson's lawyer. They wanted something in writing about future campaigns, and I understood we needed clear boundaries to move forward. We spent 4 hours going through every word of the agreement while Jackson sat across the table looking smaller than I'd ever seen him. The terms were simple enough that I wouldn't use his name in any paid advertising or sponsored content. I could still do my advocacy work and speak at conferences about domestic violence as long as I kept it general. Jackson's lawyer pushed for more restrictions, but Melinda shut that down fast, saying survivors have the right to share their experiences. When we finally signed the papers, Jackson wouldn't even look at me, and his hands shook as he wrote his name. The next morning, my pre-recorded TED Talk went live online after months of planning and editing. I'd filmed it in a controlled studio environment 2 weeks before trial started when I could still focus. The 18-minute video covered practical stuff like finding lawyers who understand domestic violence and navigating restraining orders. I talked about how the legal system often fails survivors, and what resources actually helped me get through it. Within the first day, it had 200,000 views, and people were sharing it with comments about how it helped them understand what to expect. Women messaged me saying they'd bookmarked the resource list I'd included and were using it to make safety plans. The comment section filled with survivors sharing their own tips and lawyers offering pro bono help in different states. A week later, the makeup brand called Sophie about bringing back one of my campaigns with new guidelines. They wanted me for their foundation line, but with messaging focused on resilience rather than my specific story. The contract came with strict rules about social media posts and interview topics, but the money would help pay off my legal debt. Sophie negotiated for 2 days to get better terms while other brands stayed quiet and watched how this would play out. 3 smaller companies reached out with interest but wanted to wait until the controversy died down more. I signed the makeup contract knowing it was just the first step in rebuilding my career slowly and carefully. Desmond's article came out in a major news magazine the following week with the headline, "When Lawsuits Become Weapons." He'd spent months investigating how abusers use the court system to continue controlling their victims after they leave. My case was one of 5 examples he used showing the pattern of frivolous lawsuits meant to drain resources and silence survivors. He'd been careful not to sensationalize anything and focused on the systemic problems rather than individual drama. The piece included statistics about how many survivors face retaliatory lawsuits and how few states have strong anti-slap protections. Legal experts quoted in the article called for reform and better protections for people speaking about their experiences. The article got picked up by other outlets and started conversations in legal circles about litigation abuse. That same week, I wrote a check for $15,000 to fund Me's shelter for their legal aid program. It was a third of what I'd recovered in attorney fees, but I wanted other women to have access to lawyers who understood. Funmi called me crying when the check arrived, saying it would fund free legal consultations for dozens of women. The shelter put out a press release about expanding their services, and 3 other donors matched my contribution within days. Knowing that money would help women navigate the same system I'd just survived made the whole lawsuit feel less pointless. 2 days later, Melinda forwarded me an email from the court about Jackson's sanctions for discovery misconduct. The judge had reviewed everything and ordered him into a 52-week batterer intervention program as part of the consequences. He had to attend weekly group sessions and complete homework assignments about accountability and behavior change. If he missed more than 3 sessions, he'd face contempt charges and possible jail time. The program director would send monthly reports to the court about his participation and progress. Jackson had fought it, but the judge said his courtroom behavior showed he needed intervention. For the first time, the system was forcing him to face what he'd done, instead of letting him deny and deflect. 3 months after the trial ended, I woke up early on a Saturday morning to complete silence. I made coffee in my small kitchen and stood by the window watching the sun come up over the city. My reflection caught in the glass and I saw my scar clearly in the morning light. I traced it with my finger from temple to mouth corner and waited for Jackson's voice to start playing in my head. Nothing came except the sound of birds outside and steam from my coffee cup rising in the cool air. The scar was just part of my face now, like my nose or my eyes, without any voice attached to it. I looked at it for a full minute and felt nothing but ownership of my own story and survival. Later that morning, I picked up my phone and typed out a message to Elise about doing another photo shoot. Not because anyone was demanding it, or because I had a contract deadline to meet. I told her I was ready whenever felt right for me, and we could take our time planning something meaningful. She texted back immediately with ideas about capturing this new chapter where I was setting my own timeline for everything. We made plans to meet for coffee next week and talk about what healing actually looks like when you're doing it on your own terms. That's the story. Thanks for hanging out like we're on a late call. I'll see you in the next one after a snack.